Mr. President, when government wastes taxpayer money, taxpayers have a right to know what happened. And when emboldened criminals steal money intended to help single moms and children in need, taxpayers have a right to be angry. And Americans, and I'm hearing it in Wyoming, and I'm sure you're hearing it, Mr. President, in your home state of Ohio, Americans are infuriated with the staggering amount of fraud unfolding today in the state of Minnesota. The past few weeks have shown just how deep the corruption in Minnesota has turned out to be. Investigators have now uncovered fraud schemes across 14 different Minnesota Medicaid programs. Most people don't even know there are 14 different Medicaid programs. There's fraud in all of them in Minnesota. Joe Thompson, who's U.S. Attorney in Minnesota, has spent his career prosecuting fraud. And based on his extensive investigation, he believes criminals have now stolen at least $9 billion with a B dollars from those Minnesota Medicaid programs. That is half of the total amount of money Minnesota spends for Medicaid programs in the state. Today, the fraud is so prevalent that Thompson says the state has developed a fraud tourism industry. Can you imagine that? A fraud tourism industry. Here's how these schemes work. Criminals, fraudsters, set up fake businesses for nonprofit organizations. The criminals then claim to provide services such as housing, food, and health care assistance. Then they bill Medicaid. And they bill them for services never provided. They use the names of children and enroll them into the programs. Sometimes the children don't exist, sometimes the children exist, and they're signed up by parents who are getting paid fraudulently to let them use their children's names. In 2021, taxpayers paid $4.6 million for something called Minnesota's Integrated Community Support Medicaid Program. It's a mouthful. 2021, $4.6 million. Then the fraudsters hit. 3 years later, due to criminal fraud, spending for that program ballooned to more than $170 million. From $4 million to $170 million, that's 37 times as much in just 3 years. Money completely stolen. As the governor and others in Minnesota, the Democrat elected officials looked the other way. Taxpayers similarly paid $21 million in 2021 for something called Minnesota's Housing Stabilization Services. The first 6 months of last year, due to criminal fraud, Democrats looking the other way, taxpayers paid nearly 3 times that amount. A Medicaid program claiming to help Minnesota children with autism, $6 million in 2018. By 2023, due to criminal fraud, it went from $6 million to $192 million. And daycare fraud is just one of these brazen schemes where the Democrats in Minnesota look the other way. Last month, an independent journalist visited 10 state-funded daycare sites in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul. He found no children at the daycare centers. Middle of the day, not a single child was there. 1 year ago, a local reporter visited several of those same sites. The reporter found no children at the daycare centers. They're supposed to be daycare centers, and they're getting paid to take care of children. Well, here's one of those sites, Mr. President. This is a sign from one of the states. It's called, who makes this? You can't make this stuff up. Quality Learning Center. It's supposed to be a learning center. They can't even spell learning right. But that doesn't stop the Democrats in Minnesota to keep shoveling money right to these programs, stealing money from the taxpayers, from the Democrats, going to Democrats who are running these things. Mr. President, it's appalling. The people of the United States are appalled and are furious. This ought to be a red flag for fraud. Why aren't the Democrats who run the place doing anything about it? There were 95 violations for this Leering Center alone between 2019 and 2023. Violations occurred, no records on the children. But in Minnesota, run by the Democrats, taxpayer money continued to flow. It's disgraceful, Mr. President. These aren't just one-off abuses. We now know that the fraud schemes used in the state's child care programs have been used to defraud other social programs as well. Even the New York Times has pointed to this. They say the fraud in Minnesota, run by the Democrats, is, quote, staggering in its scale and brazenness. I don't see any Democrats coming to the floor here today to point out the fraud, talk about what's happening there, how the money's been stolen from people that need it, the services that are needed by people. That means they're not getting it. The Department of Justice has charged 98 defendants in Minnesota Medicaid fraud-related cases. So far, 64 of these have been convicted. Last month, one defendant was found guilty of stealing $14 million from Medicaid. Yes, she did. She stole $14 million from Medicaid. You don't hear a word from the Minnesota Democrats coming to the floor here to talk about it. Nope. She also stole nearly $500,000 from child nutrition programs. You hear the Democrats coming to the floor and say, oh, we need more money for child nutrition, more money for child health care. Why aren't they looking at where the money is being taken from the mouths of the children? For fraudsters. What was done? How much money was taken? Let's put this into perspective. The stolen money was supposed to be used to provide 200,000 meals for hungry children who did not get fed. Democrats must think that's fine. The defendant instead sent the hundreds of thousands of dollars overseas, and she bought real estate in Kenya, in Africa. Apparently, that's how business goes in Minnesota with the Democrats who are running that state. This organized systemic theft has gone on for years under Democrat leadership, and it really exploded under Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. The Democrats have permitted schemes stacked upon schemes to drain money meant for those in need. Republicans are not going to allow this massive theft of taxpayer dollars to be ignored. Democrats want us to just look the other way. We are talking about a comprehensive approach to root out the fraud in Minnesota and across the country. Now, our Working Families Tax Cut law fights fraud. We strengthened eligibility requirements for Medicaid. We ensured that illegal immigrants don't receive taxpayer-funded health care. We put in place work requirements for Medicaid and for food stamps. These policies will protect taxpayers and will increase accountability. Additionally, Republicans are conducting aggressive congressional oversight. On Friday, the entire Senate Republican conference demanded Governor Walz explain his actions. We asked 9 specific, detailed questions. Questions such as why Minnesota failed to adopt key fraud prevention measures. Why aren't they trying to prevent the fraud? Why do they keep looking the other way? These are measures that the Department of Health and Human Services recommended to Minnesota back in May. Nope, Governor Walz, nothing to do with it. He knew about this widespread fraud. He refused to do anything about it. Senate Republicans are ready to give the Trump administration the manpower it needs to tackle this fraud in Minnesota and wherever else it appears and occurs. Now, the Trump administration has asked the Senate to confirm a new Assistant Attorney General position, a position that will be focused on the fraud. And the Senate will get that person in place and on the job quickly, Mr. President. The Trump administration has taken other bold and decisive actions to stop fraud. To further strengthen enforcement efforts, the Department of Justice has doubled the number of attorneys handling these fraud cases. The Treasury Department is cracking down on businesses in Minnesota for alleged money laundering, because that's what's happening. The Department of Health and Human Services under President Trump froze federal funding for fraud-prone programs in Minnesota. If Senate Democrats cared about stopping fraud, Why are they preparing to vote today to loosen eligibility and income verifications for Obamacare subsidies? They ought to want to be tightening these things up. But that's what the Congressional Review Act resolution from Democrat Senator Mark Warner of Virginia does, and we're going to vote on it today. Eliminating these vital protections invites more fraud. It means subsidies go to individuals who don't qualify for them. Congress shouldn't make it easier to defraud the American taxpayers. This is a wrong direction to take after the biggest fraud scandal in Minnesota history. Protecting taxpayer dollars should not be a partisan issue. The fraud scandal in Minnesota should be a wake-up call for every American taxpayer. Our federal government spends nearly $1.5 trillion each and every year to try to help feed and house and treat and care for vulnerable families and children. Those programs are there for a reason. The Democrats seem to be a piggy bank for people who want to steal from the government. Medicaid, food stamps, and other social programs have been called a lifeline. Years of waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption have pushed those who truly need the help away from the lifeline and to the back of the line. That's what Democrats have been enabling and continue to enable. Republicans aren't going to stop until the depth of this fraud is uncovered and prosecuted. And Republicans are committed to preventing it from happening again. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.